Hello and welcome to Lead by Example,
the podcast discussing current social justice issues.
Before you listen to this podcast, we just want to give you a quick disclaimer.
We are in no way an authority on these issues.
Our intention is to open healthy discussions without being insensitive.
Due to the length of this podcast, we are aware that we may not cover every intersection of injustice.
However, our aim is to build an understanding of all types of social issues which are intrinsically connected so that they can be better addressed.
We encourage anyone listening to this podcast to take part in the discussions and feel free to ask any questions or suggest topics to us. We hope you enjoy today's podcast.
Just a disclaimer, we've split this episode about white supremacy into two halves because there was just so much to talk about. So this is part 2.
So the basic definition of what white silence is when people with white privilege stay complicitly silent when it comes to the issue of race and white supremacy.
In the book Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Reni Eddo-Lodge, she mentions a quote of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. When he was, I think, in prison. He wrote a letter. It's really interesting because a lot of white people like to use Dr. Martin Luther King as an example and a frame of reference to justify tone policing of protesting and fighting for change when it comes to like Black Lives Matter, for example. And they say, well, Malcolm X didn't need to be violent because Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't violent, right? So he writes that here's the great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's councillor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action. He goes on, obviously, it's a whole letter, but basically what's important about that is that sometimes white silence, the absence of discussion and fighting for things and having these conversations is actually more destructive than
Somebody who's against, because it's almost in disguise. It's hidden behind a cloak of I'm your friend.
But actually when it comes to the real, when it comes down to it, you're not.
Right.
You haven't done anything, you're not actively doing anything. It's a good quote that is kind of always relevant, which is, now isn't the time to be silently non-racist, it's the time to be vocally anti-racist, which takes effort and it takes having those uncomfortable conversations, it takes learning and researching, but don't have the excuse of, I don't know, or I don't know enough to participate in that conversation or anything like that. That's white silence, having that privilege of not involved.
Having to know. White silence is a topic where I'm very guilty of participating in, I guess, throughout my life, like up to very recently. Just in friendship groups, racist jokes were quite normal and I would never say anything. I would well, sometimes, it depends on the level.
The extreme.
And it's almost, that's another manifestation of white silence, is when it's extreme enough that you kind of know that other people would be like, oh, that's bad, then you call it out. But if it's the constant undertones of racism, it's almost like you're putting yourself out there to call it out, and that's the difficult part of it, and that's where the mental choice of do I stay silent or do I say something comes into play. And for so many people, myself included, it's just so much easier to
stay silent
and to be like, oh, if they say it again, maybe I'll call it out, or if they keep saying it, maybe I'll call it out. But if you convince yourself of those arguments, no, you're never going to make progress with someone. So I think an example that I think my friend would be happy for me to talk about was one of my friends in school was referred to as chalk ice.
Okay.
So
white on the inside, black on the outside, right?
So he's a mixed race guy, and I made friends with him when I was 16, so I went to sixth form in his school and made friends with him there. And it was something I kind of, as an outsider, came into, so people had already been calling him that, and first of all, I didn't really understand what it meant. I hadn't heard the term before, which I guess is a privilege in itself, like having not had to experience that. And then when it was explained to me, it was explained not from him, but from the people calling him this name. So it was explained in a jokey, light-hearted manner. So I saw it as a joke. I definitely kind of laughed along with it until, I don't know the timeline, but until I had a conversation with him about it, and he said that it had been something that he'd been called throughout his time at the school, and that it made him feel really uncomfortable, and that
he didn't like it.
Yeah, and it's just things like that which, on the surface level, you'd be like, oh, it's just a joke. He doesn't take it seriously. He laughs along, but if you're in that situation, you don't want to make your friends feel uncomfortable, so sometimes, like, people do laugh along. And I know I've done that when people have made jokes, like, I can't think of an example, but if people have made jokes about my appearance or something, I laugh along because I don't want to make them feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, for sure.
And I don't want to turn the atmosphere sour or something.
I think it's sad though that he has to explain it himself. He has to be the one to be like,
right,
actually I don't like it.
Yeah.
But I know what you mean. I think it's quite easy, and I don't want to allow it, but it's quite understandable for people to not want to, in a jokey situation, for them not to want to be like the fun sponge. Yeah. So I'm sure that I hear, like, I guess it's when it's kind of, you know, where it's on the spectrum and it's not extreme, it's like mild racism. So like stereotypes. Yeah, so like stereotypes. Well, it's just easier not to put yourself in the firing line.
I think particularly in this country, overt racism is called out and seen as negative, and pretty much everyone, not everyone, but generally people are against overt acts of racism. However, we have a huge culture of racist stereotypes in this country, and everyone's out to make jokes about it, and everyone feels it's acceptable.
The majority of people,
sees it as acceptable and sees it as funny when they hear it. And it's about, I guess, training yourself to question the jokes that people make.
For sure.
When it's regarding things as important as race, question, like, where did that joke come from, and
what makes it acceptable. So if you're saying, oh, it's okay, who said that it was okay?
Yeah. And trying to imagine how you would receive that joke if you were a member of the community that joke was being made at the expense of. Another example, which I'm still very guilty of and I need to work on myself and get better at, is choosing to repost and share on social media things that I agree with and things like activism stuff, rather than contributing my own opinion to conversations, or not even opinion, but even just phrasing things in my own way to my community or friends. It's a lot easier to just click a button and it's somebody else's words, so you're almost less accountable if someone disagrees with it, or if someone wants to argue with it. It's just that step back from direct.
And you've almost got that excuse of, if someone does call you out for it or something, you can say, oh, well, I only agree with that part of it, or you've got these excuses when it wasn't your own product, like you didn't produce it yourself, which is something that I agree I'm so guilty of, and that's why recently I've kind of had to change how I
and I think there's value to be had in those things.
For sure.
There's so many good people and advocates out there with great ways of articulating themselves and presenting arguments and all sorts. And so I'm not in any way saying don't go out and share stuff that you see that you agree with. I'm not going to stop.
Yeah.
But it's something to be aware of, that if you're only doing that, just think a bit about what can I say? How can I add to this? How can I explain it to people that might not understand it? How can I make it more palatable to my friends and family that might find it aggressive, that might tone police it? How can I use this message to effectively reach people?
You can tailor it
Right.
to your own audience sometimes. And I also think it's kind of like the first stepping stone into contributing to the conversation. So sometimes people,
Yeah.
they've just started to kind of learn about a certain topic and they're not 100% sure of what their views are and what is right and what's wrong. And I guess I hate using those words because it's not really that black and white, but it's like, you know, what's acceptable and what isn't. So it's a good way to start agreeing with things and sharing things with a following.
Right. And when you're first learning about things, you're absorbing a lot, but not necessarily prepared or ready to create.
Yeah.
So when you read things and you're like, yes, I do it, I know that I agree with that, but you haven't fully
formed your own opinions.
Right. It's and it's a good way of going on that journey, but it's not the end point.
Oh, so sorry. So one example that is in the book is staying silent about your anti-racism work for fear of losing friends and followers. So I had to kind of take myself away from social media for a few months so that I could, I mean, partly it was for my own mental health and the fact that I didn't know I was going through like a transition anyway, but I had to, it was only going away from it and then coming back to it that I then realised how much I don't value having followers who aren't open to the messages that I'm sharing and the anti-racism work that I'm doing. I don't want them viewing my profile. I don't want them in my space, if that makes sense. So if I'm holding back from sharing this stuff based on losing friends or followers, then are those the friends and followers that I want? And if they're not going to listen, then there's no point in them being around at all. Yeah, so if I'm not sharing that anti-racism work for the majority, like to help the majority based on the minority of people who might unfollow or not agree.
So I've often heard white people using the N-word, which I honestly think you only have to do a little bit of research into the origins of that word to understand that it's wrong
For sure.
as a white person to
And I
kind
think
of feel obliged, not obliged, to feel
entitled
to saying it.
I think that is probably the most basic level of not being anti-racist, just not being racist.
Right.
And also I find it really funny with this topic because people will say to me, oh, why don't you use it? Why don't you say the N-word? I'll be like, why would I? What is the need? For me to actively take myself away from something, that's not strange. For me to actively participate in something, that's weird. You've got to have a reason for that. It's the same way like people say, oh, so you don't eat meat. Like, why don't you eat meat? Why do you eat meat?
Yeah,
like,
the question goes both ways.
Right.
Yeah.
Why don't you drink? Why do you drink? You have to make an effort, a conscious effort to do something, not to do something.
It's basically complicity. If I sat there and heard white people saying this word
Without saying
and
anything.
didn't say anything, and I did because, well, I don't really, there's not a because about it, like I did, and that's something I have to look back on and reflect on and be like, okay, well, that's a very easy thing which I now have to do differently and speak about if I ever hear people saying it.
Public service announcement. It's never okay for a white person to say that word. It's never okay for a non-black person to say that word. Even if a black person tells you it's okay, it's not okay. It's unacceptable. You don't do it. Even if one person, because this is the thing, a lot of white people will have one token black friend who will entitle them and say, oh yeah, I don't care if you use it. So that all those white people will be like, oh, well, my black friend says it's okay to use it. It's not okay.
So I think throughout my teenage years, as soon as I kind of started to be more self-aware and started to think about who I wanted to be as a person, I was almost obsessed with niceness and wanting to be the nice girl, and I was pretty good at that, and I was like,
I was never good at that.
yeah, you've always been a bitch. I was obsessed with being kind and being nice, and to be viewed as nice, particularly as a woman, you kind of keep your opinions to yourself and let everyone else talk, and don't hassle people. I think a social thing for women as well is to be quiet and...
Docile?
Exactly. Is to be docile. And as soon as you're not, you're whiny or attention-seeking or opinionated. And I think I really fed into the narrative about that, which I think held me back from participating in conversations about race, among other things.
So I feel like I've got a similar sort of thing, but not quite the same. So people have always told me to have an attitude of not getting involved in conversations that I have nothing to do with. If someone says something about me, I don't have to speak up about it. I don't have to prove them wrong. It's fine. Just like let it go, leave it alone. And I think that fed into my complicity for
Your silence.
Yeah, my silence. So not involving myself in conversations that weren't really anything to do with me. So if I heard someone saying something that wasn't right, I didn't say anything because it was nothing to do with me. And I didn't want to come off attention seeking because I wasn't involved in that conversation in the first place. So I think that's probably how my white silence has manifested.
So another way in which I feel my white silence displays itself is through actively avoiding bringing up conversations with certain people in my life because I don't want to damage that relationship. And I think in general it's if you look up to someone or if you respect people, you don't like to think about their imperfections. So by not bringing it up,
you don't know.
You don't have to reveal that.
Ignorance is bliss.
Exactly.
Because I've done that for years. Like, I've done that. I would say I started getting involved in, like, activism and social justice issues probably when I was, like, 18. So it's been pretty much 6 years of not having conversations with people, friends and family, because I don't want to hear that. Because once I hear those things, those biases that they have, or those opinions they have, or values that don't coincide with mine, I'll never be able to get that out of my head, and therefore the relationship will be tarnished. So for me, once I know that, you know, someone's racist or someone's homophobic, I won't be able to have that relationship with them anymore.
Yeah, it won't be the same. I also find... Oh, I just keep shaking the thing. I also find that I lean more towards advocacy when it's something I can personally relate to. So I'm often very vocal with people about feminism because I've got my own experiences to back my points, and I kind of use that as an excuse to not talk about race and other issues that I don't have as much of a first-hand experience with. Because I'm like, oh, well, I can't speak for that person.
Right. And you see that a lot with people saying, I don't want to speak on that because I don't have enough knowledge on it, which is fine. But in saying that, the next step should be you collecting more knowledge.
Right.
That should be you educating yourself.
Right. So if you're aware enough to know that you don't know enough, then you should already be seeking out more knowledge.
Right. As soon as you know, as soon as there's a sign that you don't know enough, then you go and find out more. White exceptionalism is, at its essence, the belief that you as a white person are exempt from any effects, benefits and conditioning of white supremacy, and therefore the work of anti-racism doesn't really apply to you. Okay, so one way that it comes across really obviously is when people say, I'm not racist, I'm one of the good ones. Like, personally, I'm not racist. Without, number one, without actually looking into what the definition of racism is.
It essentially reveals itself as people who are already engaging in the conversation about race, who feel like they've done a bit of research into it, and therefore, because maybe they're doing more than the immediate people around them, they feel exempt from the criticism of racism and systemic racism, and they might see comments on systemic racism and feel like it doesn't apply to them. Do you know what's so funny that I've just noticed that I like keep doing, which is just like white exceptionalism displaying itself perfectly, is how I'm saying them and they
And not us.
and not us.
100%. For a long time, I spoke about white people as if I wasn't a white person.
Right.
For ages. I would always be like, oh, white people. So most white people are more afraid of being called racist than actually being racist, which is one way that white exceptionalism shows up. So they care more about their own image and how they appear. Yeah, how people perceive them than actually whether their actions are harmful and whether they're, you know, doing anti-racist work.
And it's the belief as well that you don't need to dig deeper, but because you've scratched the surface of looking into like the history of it maybe, or you've read a book on how to self-reflect about racism, or you've done a couple of different things, that you are now anti-racist. You've done the work.
You're an ally.
Yeah, hands.
I'm Matteo.
Like,
hands clean.
Hands clean. Like, you've done the work. Your job's done.
Yeah.
Now you can sit happily on your ally seat and watch all of the racist people that aren't doing anything. Like, it's...
Judge them.
Yeah, it's judgmental, isn't it? And dangerous because it because it's almost an excuse to not do more work, and it's an excuse to not go further than you've already gone. And I think, yeah, it's important to be aware of and acknowledge, and it's something we all do. Like, there's not any white person advocating for racial equality or anti-racism that hasn't felt white exceptionalism, because it's such a human reaction, is to almost protect yourself from criticism and judgment and shame, that you look for everything that you have done in order to cover up the things that you aren't doing. That's another one, which still I do, is I find it much more comfortable to reflect on things I did long ago in the past than to think about something I might have done yesterday that was questionable or problematic.
Yeah, so just distance that from yourself. I used to do that, but now I'm better.
Right.
Rather than I still do that now, and I need to recognise that and change it and improve.
So what do you think are your personal takes from what we've discussed so far? Like, what?
I feel like I'm like, you know, one of those kids in class that, well, I mean, this was me, who didn't do their homework. And they're asked to read out the answers, and I'm like...
Like, what do you think are your personal takes from at least learning about these concepts and how they reveal themselves? What what do you think? A, what have you learned about yourself from it? And B, what would you maybe do differently in the future?
I think one of the biggest things I've learned is that you can always do better. And up until this point, I mean, I guess it's probably going to be a continual thing, but I always think, oh, but I've done so much. Like especially because within my family and my friendship group, I am definitely like, people would see me as like the one who cares about black people or like cares about racism. And so then I almost use that as an excuse to be like, oh, well, you know, I've been fighting about this for years, so it isn't my place. It isn't necessary for me to fight anymore. And even like the other week when my sister was complaining about some sort of conversation where there were a few racist comments and stuff like that, she was getting really frustrated. I said to her, well, you know, this is why I have chosen not to participate in those conversations, because I just get really frustrated and there's just no point. And then like a day later I said to her, actually, what I said the other day, I take that back, because that is in itself, that's white privilege and that's exceptionalism, and that's like, oh well, I've done enough, and like I'm going to take a step back now, I don't have to think about this. It's just a lot of work in my mind, it's just very mentally taxing. And that for me is like showing that this is a topic, this is a debate, this is a discussion that I can separate from myself and I can put it to one side and I can carry on with my life. Whereas like black people and people of colour don't get that privilege. They don't get that, oh well, I don't have to think about it today, because that's a part of their life, that's a part of who they are and how they interact with the world, how the world interacts with them.
Yeah.
So in itself, that is a massive white privilege that I have.
Right.
I think one big thing for me is tone policing. That's always stood out for me, because for a long time, before I even knew what tone policing was and I understood what it was, I had tone policed a lot of people. And now I make it, especially since reading this book, I make it a habit in my life to check why I feel that way about that person and make sure I know that it's not because I'm trying to alter their message so that it can fit nicely to my ears so that I can enjoy listening to it. What do you feel like you've taken away so far from this book, and what would you do differently moving forward?
I've learned the deeper meanings to like almost all of these terms I'd heard of but hadn't looked into very much. So there's definitely been a big learning curve there. And I think one of the biggest ones for me is looking at it more personally. I think this book is on purpose quite confronting.
For sure.
And it definitely causes a mental reaction in you where you're like, oh, this is pushing some buttons. But if you push through that and you carry on reading it, I don't know, yeah.
It's worth it.
Right. And you realise why she's written it in that manner. So to get to the point, I've begun to reflect more on the fact that I have personally caused harm and hurt black people and people of colour. And to accept that has been like a big thing for me, because with this white exceptionalism, I've always put it on other people and I've always kind of distanced myself from the racist people without looking internally as much. So that's the first, like, and that was, I guess, quite early on in the book, like quite the biggest shock to the system, I guess, and something which I now am going to be constantly questioning myself and constantly reflecting on interactions and situations that I find myself in to try and be better at not being complicit. And another one for me was, I think you already really said it, but how ignorance is privilege. There's no, that's a fact. Like, being able to be ignorant about something is a privilege.
To not have even experienced it in the first place.
I guess I've kind of in that I've said what I would do, what I'm doing differently, and what I want to continue to do differently is to almost be in a constant state of self-awareness and reflection, so that I'm going to make mistakes and I'm going to get it wrong, but to be aware of what I'm doing and what I'm saying and what about that situation could I have done better.
This is the first discussion that we're having about this book, and there will be more. But I think it's important to know when you read this book, you have to be ready to be vulnerable and listen and learn and be open to being told where you've been wrong. And that is where you're gonna be able to see the effect of the work that you're doing. If you're not ready to hear that, then you're not ready to read this book, because it's very confronting and your reflexes will kick in where you'll become defensive and you won't be able to hear what she's saying. So it's not a comfortable book to read. It's not easy reading, but it's necessary, and it is.
And it's not meant to be easy reading, and it's not meant to be a self-help book. It's meant to be a way that we as white people can work, a book that we as white people can work through and contribute less to systemic racism.
So thank you guys so much for watching, and we hope you've learned a little bit in this podcast. Hopefully it will have started you thinking about some of the ways that you are complicit in white supremacy. And we will see you in the next one.
Yeah, bye. Oh, this is a big one. So
That's what she said.
oh, that's an interesting point, really.
I don't know how to phrase it. I think one thing to take away, obviously this is the first.
You're gonna have to say that again. I was pulling your face.
As follows. No, don't say that, baby. That sounds There are kind of... Oh, no. So this week... White silence.
I thought you were demonstrating.
Nothing to it. Tone put... Oh, I can't say it while I'm laughing. White silence. No.
No.
They all just sound so similar. And white accepts.